The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like a swarm of insects trapped in glass. 3 years. Laura Bennett had worked these corridors for 3 years, and in that time she'd learned the rhythm of Mercy General the way a sailor learns the ocean, by feel, by instinct, by the way the currents move beneath the surface. Morning shift started at 6:15. By 6:30 the coffee in the break room had already gone bitter. By 7, the attending physicians began their rounds, their voices cutting through the fog of night shift like scalpels through tissue. She was restocking the supply cart on the 3rd floor when she first heard about the general. The intercom crackled. Code Blue, Trauma Bay 2. All available medical personnel respond. Laura didn't pause. She finished sliding the last box of alcohol swabs into the metal bin, the plastic crackling beneath her scarred fingers like kindling about to ignite. Her hands were the kind that had held too many things together for too long, calluses layered over older calluses, a thin white scar running from her left wrist to her knuckles like a river of memory. She taped them at work. The tape was medical grade, and she changed it every morning at 4:30 when no one was watching. The trauma bay was already chaos when she arrived. Controlled chaos, the kind that happened when a human body arrived at the hospital broken in ways that required precision and speed. The paramedics were shouting vitals. The nurses were moving with the synchronized efficiency of a drill team that had practiced this dance 1,000 times. Laura took her position without being asked, grabbing the monitor leads and watching as the attending physician, not Sterling, thank God, began his assessment. The patient was a man somewhere between 40 and 50, his frame muscular and tight despite the violence that had been done to him. His right arm bore a tattoo, faded to the color of old denim, the edges blurred from whatever fire or shrapnel had caught him. Laura's eyes locked on it for exactly 1 second. That was all the time she allowed herself. L. Bennett saved my life, Sangin 2019. The letters were precise. Military-grade tattoo work, the kind done in a forward operating base by someone who understood that ink sometimes needed to mean more than decoration. She forced her gaze away. Her breathing stayed level. Her hands remained steady as she applied the EKG pads to his chest, her movements practiced and efficient, the muscle memory so deep it didn't require thought. This was the work. This was what she did. Nothing more. The patient had no voice. That became clear within the first 30 seconds. His mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water, his face contorting with the effort of trying to produce sound that wouldn't come. The attending physician examined his neck, running gloved fingers along what remained of his vocal anatomy, and his expression shifted from professional concern to something closer to dismay. Shrapnel damage, the doctor said. Vocal cords are completely shredded. Larynx is compromised. He needs specialty care. I'm calling in surgical consultation. He stepped back from the bed, peeling off his gloves with sharp, decisive movements. Get him stabilized. Monitor his airway. Do not let that tube come out. The second he loses the airway, it's going to be a nightmare to re-establish it. The general's eyes were grey. Laura noticed this the way she noticed everything now, the way a combat medic notices blood type and respiratory rate and the size of the exit wound. Grey eyes with the kind of clarity that came from someone accustomed to reading threats in the fraction of a second between life and death. Those eyes found hers for a moment, and Laura felt something shift in her chest like a fault line remembering an old earthquake. No recognition. His gaze passed across her face and found nothing. The sedatives were already working, the medications clouding whatever remained of his recent memory, turning his past into watercolor smudges of pain and noise and the sound of his own voice dying in his throat. He blinked, and she became invisible again. Bennett. One of the nurses, Marcus's mother's friend from the unit 2 floors down, was pointing at the monitor. Line starting to drop. You catching this? Catching it, Laura said. Her voice came out measured and calm, the product of years spent not drawing attention, not standing out, not becoming the kind of person anyone remembered. He's dipping into the low 90s. Watch the pressure. He was borderline on arrival. She stayed until the transfer was complete, until the general was in the ICU bed with continuous monitoring and a whiteboard where someone had written his name in blue marker, General James Mercer, admitted through emergency transport, status, non-verbal, trauma level, critical. Laura read the name and made a note of it in the way she made notes of everything, filed it away in a compartment of memory that never got dusty, never got closed. By 8 in the morning the first surgeon had evaluated him and refused the case. Dr. Sterling heard about it in the hallway near the nurse's station, his voice carrying the kind of ease that came from never having learned to speak quietly. Complex case, Sterling was saying to another physician, someone Laura didn't recognize, someone probably important given the way they were deferring to him. Vocal cord reconstruction on top of trauma recovery. The liability exposure alone, we're not equipped for that level of specialty work. Too much can go wrong. Better to refer him to Johns Hopkins or the Pentagon Medical Center. Let them handle it. He was peeling an orange as he spoke, the rind curling in his hands, his movements casual and assured. 7 surgeons on staff. Not a single one of them is going to want this. And that's before we even get into the infection risk, the psychological complications of losing your voice. He walked past Laura's station without acknowledging her existence. She was inventory checking the crash cart. The job required focus, precision, the kind of attention to detail that meant knowing the location of every syringe, every drug, every piece of equipment that might need to save a life in the 60 seconds between normal and crisis. She didn't look up. She never did. The next surgeon to evaluate the general was Dr. Hoffman from ENT. He spent 40 minutes in the room and emerged shaking his head. Post-trauma airway management, he said to the attending. This is a Pentagon case. Military Medical Center. That's where this patient needs to be. We're not set up for it. 1. 2. 3 surgeons came and went throughout the afternoon. Each one declined. Each one cited different reasons: complexity, liability, lack of specialist support, institutional protocol. Laura heard it all while she moved through the corridors with the kind of invisibility that came from being competent and quiet and never requiring attention. She was the kind of nurse that hospitals ran on, the kind that didn't call in sick, didn't demand raises, didn't make trouble. She was the kind that could be replaced easily, forgotten quickly, erased if necessary. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 4 surgeons had evaluated the general and declined. By 4, it was 6. By 6, Sterling was walking through the unit again, this time with a patient folder in his hands and the particular satisfaction of someone whose judgment had been validated. No one's touching this one, he said to the attending. We've got 7 attending physicians and not a single one will take the case. That's the market speaking. That's institutional wisdom saying this patient's needs exceed our capacity. We refer him up the chain, he gets transferred in the morning, and we maintain our standards. He smiled. It was the kind of smile that showed teeth without showing anything else. Good work turning people away. Better to be honest about limitations than to let someone get hurt by incompetence. The words were professional. The meaning was clear. Laura was in the break room when she heard Sterling's voice in the hallway outside. She was refilling the coffee maker with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done it 10,000 times before. The machine hissed as the new water hit the heating element, the sound almost loud enough to cover the conversation happening on the other side of the wall. She's in there, someone was saying. A younger nurse, someone new. Laura Bennett. She's been here 3 years. Quiet. Solid. But nobody really knows anything about her. She keeps to herself. Sterling's response came right after, sharp as a knife. Of course she does. That's how people are when they're hiding something. Quiet nurses aren't usually quiet because they're modest. They're quiet because they've got no choice. Might want to remember that. Laura didn't move. The coffee finished brewing. The sound of it dripping into the pot was steady and even and mechanical. She pulled out the pot, filled her mug with something that looked like routine, and walked back to the ICU as if she'd heard nothing at all. The general was still sedated when she made the rounds at 7 o'clock. The ventilator was doing his breathing for him, the sound of it filling his chest and emptying it again in a rhythm that had nothing to do with his own will. His arm was visible above the blanket, the tattoo clearly marked in that old faded ink. Laura ran a blood pressure cuff and wrote the numbers on the whiteboard, 118/76. Stable. The kind of stable that was only temporary, that could change in 6 seconds with no warning at all. She didn't touch the arm. She didn't allow her eyes to rest on the name written there any longer than was necessary. But as she turned to leave, as she was moving away from his bedside, the general's eyes opened for just a moment. Grey. Focused. The kind of eyes that had seen terrible things and survived them. They found her eyes. Held for exactly 3 seconds. Then the medication pulled him under again, and he was gone. Laura stepped into the hallway outside the ICU, and her hands, those scarred, steady hands, were trembling. Not from fear. Not from grief. From the kind of restraint that came from holding too much inside for too long, from watching someone you once saved with your own body now unable to recognize your face. She pressed her palms flat against the cool stainless steel of the supply cabinet in the hallway and breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, the way they'd taught her 18 years ago in a training facility that officially no longer existed. But that wasn't the worst part. The supply cabinet door swung closed with a soft click, and Laura's breathing steadied. Her hands were steady now. They always were, eventually. She turned back toward the corridor just as the intercom crackled overhead, Dr. Sterling's voice, clipped and authoritative, summoning all attending physicians to Conference Room B emergency meeting. Immediate. She knew what that meant before she walked past the window and saw the general's chart spread across the mahogany table. 7 doctors. She counted them as they filed in, their faces varying degrees of skeptical. Sterling sat at the head, already shaking his head, already dismissing something he hadn't even heard yet. The general's case lasted 11 minutes. Laryngeal reconstruction post-blast trauma, the hospitalist began, pulling up imaging. Shrapnel lodged in the vocal cords, cricoid cartilage severely damaged. He's stable for now, but without intervention. Sterling cut him off with a raised hand. Complex case. Beyond our scope. He leaned back in his chair like a man who had already decided. Who's taking it? Silence. Laura watched from the doorway, still holding the lunch tray she'd picked up from the break room. Turkey sandwich, apple juice, a small cup of applesauce. Dr. Reeves spoke first. The liability exposure alone, our malpractice insurance doesn't cover laryngeal reconstruction. This needs Duke or Johns Hopkins. Somewhere with a specialty program. Exactly, Sterling said, nodding as if Reeves had just confirmed something obvious. We lack the necessary specialist support. Can't do it in-house. Next. Dr. Patel cleared her throat. Institutional protocol requires pre-approval from our ENT department for any procedure involving the larynx. We don't have an ENT. She glanced at her colleagues. It's a resource issue. Sterling made a note. 2 down. 5 more heads nodded in sequence like dominoes, all of them finding reasons, all of them correct in their own way, all of them reaching the same conclusion. Insurance concerns. Liability exposure. Lack of specialists. Institutional protocol. The words bounced around the table like a game everyone knew how to play. By the time the 11th minute ended, all 7 had spoken. All 7 had said no. Sterling stood and turned directly toward the doorway where Laura stood. His eyes found hers and held, and something cold moved across his face. Looks like we're transferring him to Savannah Memorial, Sterling announced. Bennett, call transport. Get him out of here by end of shift. Yes, doctor, Laura said quietly. And clean up whatever mess you're holding there. He gestured at her tray. You're dripping juice on the floor. She wasn't. The lid was sealed. But she nodded and moved back down the hallway, feeling 7 pairs of eyes on her departure. She set the tray down in the break room, her break room, the one designated for nurses and staff, and sat at the corner table with her back to the wall, the way you did when you'd spent 18 years learning that corners were safer. The cafeteria was crowded at lunch. 2:30 in the afternoon, the shift change, and Mercy General staff flooded the space with the practiced chaos of people who had 6 minutes to eat before returning to triage. Laura carried her replacement lunch. She'd lost the first one somewhere between deciding that Sterling had already made his choice and accepting that the general would leave Savannah General without treatment. She was halfway through a salad when Sterling walked in, still wearing his white coat like armor. He didn't look at her immediately. He made a show of getting coffee, of checking his watch, of pretending she didn't exist. But his path to the cashier took him directly past her table. He stopped. "You know," he said, his voice carrying across 3 occupied tables and into the ears of a nursing student from the University of Georgia doing clinical rounds, "I've been wondering about your credentials." Laura's fork paused halfway to her mouth. She set it down slowly. 3 years here and no one's ever seen your certifications. No LinkedIn profile. No prior employment verification. He smiled. Strange for someone so eager to work harder than everyone else. The room had gotten quieter. Not silent yet, she could hear someone's pager buzzing, a coffee machine hissing, but the temperature of attention had shifted toward her table. Sterling knew it had. He was reading the room the way a conductor reads an orchestra, timing his next move for maximum resonance. In fact, he continued, reaching down and lifting her tray by one corner, "I wonder if you're qualified to be here at all." The tray tilted. The salad bowl didn't slide so much as pour, greens and vinaigrette and croutons cascading across the table and onto her scrubs in one efficient motion. The plate followed, pasta salad splattering across her thighs. The apple juice, the water glass, all of it coming down like a small indictment. The room went completely silent. Sterling looked at her with something that wasn't quite contempt and wasn't quite curiosity. It was the expression of a man testing an animal to see if it would flinch. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice carrying through the cafeteria with the precision of someone used to being obeyed. "You're not special forces material. You're a nobody nurse. Act like it." He walked away before she could respond. His coffee cup gleamed under the fluorescent lights. His shoes clicked against the tile floor in a rhythm that sounded almost like applause. Laura sat motionless for 3 seconds. Then she reached for the napkins on the table next to her and began cleaning up the mess with the kind of careful precision that came from experience. A nursing student stood to help, but Laura waved her back down. "Don't draw attention. Don't show weakness. Don't give him the satisfaction." The salad was gone. The pasta was spreading across her lap in sticky rivulets. She could feel the juice cooling against her skin, running down her left calf and soaking into her socks. Around her, staff members were pretending to eat, pretending to talk, all of them hyper-aware that something had just happened that shouldn't have. She stood, gathered the ruined food, and walked to the trash bin. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was measured. But when she glanced up at the nearest window's reflection, she saw a single tear sliding down her right cheek, just one, just there, just long enough for her to see it before she wiped it away without slowing her pace. She returned to the table, picked up her tray, and walked out of the cafeteria. As she passed Sterling's position by the coffee station, she spoke quietly. "Just for him. I've carried better men than you through worse messes, Doctor." The words landed like a rifle round. Sterling's hand froze on his coffee cup. His back stiffened. 3 people near him pretended not to hear, but they had heard. The nursing student had heard. A resident had heard. The words would travel through Mercy General's corridors like a pulse, finding their way into break rooms and nurse stations and storage closets by the time evening shift arrived. Sterling turned to face her, but Laura was already moving. She didn't wait for his response. She didn't wait for anything. She simply continued down the corridor and pushed through the cafeteria doors, leaving him standing there with his coffee cup suspended in midair and a look on his face like someone who'd just realized he'd underestimated the animal after all. Behind her, someone whispered, "Did she just?" but the sentence never finished. Laura was already 3 corridors away, already moving toward the general's room, already thinking about transfer protocols and bed availability at other hospitals, already doing what she always did. She did her job. What she didn't know was that Sterling was already making calls. To the hospital administrator. To the board chairman. To the references listed on a nursing school application that would crumble the moment someone actually checked it. He was building a case the way someone builds a fire, one piece of kindling at a time, each one essential, each one positioned to catch when the match was finally lit. The room was silent except for the ventilator. 2:06 a.m. The general lay motionless, his chest rising and falling in mechanical rhythm, and Laura stood at the bedside watching the monitors like they were the only truth left in the world. Saturation readings had held steady for 4 hours. 94%. Good. Stable. The kind of stable that let you breathe in a hospital at 2 in the morning. Then the number started falling. 92, 90. The oxygen saturation dropped like a stone down a well. Laura's hand moved to the call button and stopped. Sterling had left explicit instructions, any change in the general's condition required his presence. No exceptions. No judgment calls. Not from the nurses. Not from her. The order had come down typed and formal, a memo slipped into the chart with the precision of someone building a case one piece of kindling at a time. 88, 86. The beeping accelerated. Her jaw tightened. The general's breathing had changed, shallower now, struggling against resistance that shouldn't be there. No sound from the ventilator. That was the problem. The machine was pushing air out but nothing was coming back. The pressure was building inside his chest cavity like a fist tightening around his lungs. Tension pneumothorax. She'd seen it before. Not here. In Sangin. In the dark. In the chaos. She didn't reach for the phone. Instead, she reached for the crash cart. The wheels squeaked against the tile floor as she positioned it beside the bed. The sound was loud in the silence, accusatory. She opened the airway kit and her hands moved through the steps like water finding its path downhill, no hesitation, no consultation, just muscle memory from 100 previous saves in places where doctors weren't walking the halls at 2 a.m. because there were no halls, just sand and cordite and the weight of men you couldn't afford to lose. The 14-gauge needle was cold in her fingers. She found the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the anatomical landmark burned into her body like coordinates. The skin sterilized with chlorhexidine. The smell, antiseptic sharp, clean, nothing like the copper and dust of field medicine, but the motion was identical. The needle went in. Air hissed out. A small sound. Enormous. The ventilator's resistance dropped. The general's oxygen saturation stopped falling. Stopped dead. She watched the monitor climb. 78, 82. The rhythm was wrong, his heart was racing, compensating, but his lungs were re-inflating. The needle stayed in place, a temporary window to release the pressure that had nearly killed him. She'd need a chest tube. A real one. But not yet. Not until she could explain this without destroying everything she'd built here. Sinus rhythm, she whispered. Not to anyone. Just confirming what the monitor was telling her. The words were automatic. Clinical. Old. The kind of words a senior chief petty officer used when she was reading vital signs in the field, when lives depended on having the data before the emotion. 88, 90. 92. The saturation kept climbing. But somewhere between the needle going in and the pressure releasing, Sangin had come back. She was there and she wasn't there. The general's face blurred into the face of Corporal Martinez, 23 years old, shrapnel through his left lung, 3 clicks of enemy fire between the compound and the LZ. She could feel the weight of him, not the actual weight, the memory was precise enough, 185 pounds of wounded Marine, his arm around her shoulders, her arm locked around his torso, running through streets where every window was a firing position. Behind them, Petty Officer Chen was carrying a staff sergeant with a femur fracture. Behind him, their corpsman was half dragging a lieutenant with a head wound that looked worse than it was. For clicks. That's what they called it in reports. Cold. Mathematical. For kilometers of open ground and no cover and enemy positions on the second and third floors of every building that faced the street. In her head, it was red and loud and the kind of hot that only comes from running full speed in body armor and a rucksack while your hands keep another human being attached to the world. The general gasped. Laura was back. The needle was still in place. The saturation was 94 now. His eyes had opened, still clouded with medication, still without recognition, but alive. Breathing. His hand moved slightly, not conscious, just an involuntary twitch, and she let him grip her wrist. "You're okay," she said. The words came out in her nurse voice. Soft. Reassuring. The voice she wore like scrubs. "Your lung collapsed. I decompressed it. You're stable now." He couldn't respond. His vocal cords were shredded. That was why they were here, why Sterling had turned him away, why the other 6 doctors had fallen in line like dominoes. 7 refusals. She'd counted. Every one of them walking away from a decorated officer because the case was too complex, the liability was too high, the institutional protocol didn't accommodate miracles. The general's eyes moved to hers. For a moment, just a moment, something flickered behind the medication fog. Recognition? No. Just the gratitude of a man remembering he was alive. Laura stayed at the bedside. The chest tube could wait for hours. Could wait until dawn when Sterling made his rounds. Could wait until she could tell him what she'd done and watch him decide whether to bury it or crucify her for it. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm. She sat in the plastic chair beside the bed and didn't move until the eastern window started turning grey and the night shift began giving way to morning, and somewhere in the hospital, a senior attending physician was about to wake up to a problem that wasn't on his schedule. The room went so quiet you could hear the rain outside. The first drops had started falling around 3 a.m., tapping against the window like someone asking for entry. By 6 a.m. it had turned into something harder. Laura could hear it even through the walls, the kind of rain that comes before change, before the world tips sideways and nothing ever looks the same again. The rain had turned into something harder by 6 in the morning. Not the kind that came and went, but the kind that settled over Savannah like a weight, like the sky itself had decided to press down and stay. Dr. Sterling stood in the hallway outside the general's room, his face still wet from the ER entrance, his shoes leaving wet prints on the linoleum that looked like small accusations. He'd been called at 5:38 a.m. by the night shift charge nurse. There was a problem. Code blue averted. Emergency decompression. No doctor present. Just the quiet floor nurse. Just Laura. Sterling's jaw worked silently for exactly 3 seconds. Then he moved. The phone call to hospital board chairman Marcus Whitfield happened at 6:13 a.m., before the breakfast carts had even left the kitchen. Sterling's voice was steady, controlled, the voice of a man protecting institutions. "Marcus, we have a significant liability event. One of our floor nurses performed an invasive emergency procedure without physician authorization or oversight. Tension pneumothorax decompression. Needle thoracostomy. She's not even credentialed for ACLS certification renewal." A pause. Sterling knew how to use silence like a weapon. "I need to escalate this immediately. Can I count on your support when this goes to administration?" Within 18 minutes, the State Medical Investigator's Office had received a formal request for credential audit. Within 32 minutes, Sterling had called Laura's fabricated nursing school references. Within 41 minutes, he stood in the physician's lounge where 6 staff doctors were drinking coffee and announced, quietly, to the room, she performed an authorized thoracostomy at 2 a.m. Cowboy medicine. That's what we're dealing with now. The word spread through Mercy General like a contagion. By 8:24 a.m., Sterling had filed his formal complaint. By 9:06 a.m., human resources had been notified. By 11:15 a.m., Laura had been called to the administration office on the 4th floor, where a woman named Patricia Chen from HR sat across from her with a suspension letter already printed and waiting. The words on the page seemed to vibrate in the harsh fluorescent light: pending investigation into unauthorized medical procedures, violation of hospital protocol, and scope of practice violations. Suspension effective immediately. Credential review required before reinstatement. Patricia didn't make eye contact. You should not return to the unit. Not while this is ongoing. Sterling stood in the hallway outside that office, waiting for Laura to emerge. She came through the door with her ID badge already in her hand. She'd removed it without being asked. The plastic caught the light as she held it out, and Sterling took it like a trophy. His smile wasn't large, but it was complete. We have standards here, Bennett. And unauthorized procedures don't fit those standards. Not in my hospital. His voice carried easily down the corridor. 3 nurses paused, pretended to check charts. 1 resident stopped at a water fountain. Sterling made sure they all heard. Your cowboy medicine won't be tolerated. Not anymore. Laura didn't respond. She turned and walked toward the staff exit, her movements unhurried, her face level. But what Sterling couldn't see in that moment, what he would never see, was that she had taken exactly 1 measured breath before he spoke. 1 breath to absorb the weight of his words. 1 breath to remind herself that she had carried men heavier than this through worse darkness than this. 1 tear had escaped when Patricia handed her the suspension letter, just 1, sliding down her cheek before she could suppress it. Laura had wiped it away without breaking eye contact with the HR officer. Without flinching. Without giving either of them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She was out of the hospital by 12:51 p.m. The rain had intensified by evening, hammering the streets of Savannah like it had a vendetta. Laura stood in Bonaventure Cemetery, in the section where the live oaks grew so thick they created their own weather. The headstone in front of her was granite, simple, with Tom's name carved into it and the dates that contained their entire marriage, 1984 to 2015. 9 years. She hadn't worn her dress uniform in 4 years. It was still in a locked box at home, in the back of the bedroom closet, behind winter coats she never used. The uniform she'd been told never to wear again. Never to speak about. Never to use as proof of anything. The rain soaked through her civilian jacket, cold and relentless. It plastered her hair to her neck and ran in rivulets down her temples, mixing with the tears she didn't bother hiding anymore because nobody was here to see them and Sterling couldn't weaponize grief. She stood at Tom's grave and whispered words the rain immediately swallowed. I saved him once and I can't even tell them. Tom, I failed. I failed everyone. Her hands were shaking. Not from cold. Not from fear. From the fact that she had spent 7 years walking a wire, keeping her head down, performing competence while burying herself so completely that the one person she'd saved in the dark half a world away couldn't even recognize her name when he saw it tattooed on his own arm. She'd broken protocol, not the hospital's petty protocol, but something deeper. She'd broken the silence that was supposed to protect her. And now the silence was destroying her instead. The unit patch was still in her jacket lining, sewn in place by her own hands the night she came home from Sangin, the fabric so faded it was almost colorless. She'd kept it for 7 years. Through the funeral. Through the quiet job applications and the false references and the paperwork that created a person named Laura Bennett who had been born in 1989 instead of 1981, who had no service record, who had no history except what she'd invented. The patch was the only real thing she carried. She pulled the jacket collar back, felt the fabric there, rough and familiar. She almost pulled it out. Almost threw it into the rain. Almost let it wash away like everything else. But something stopped her. Not hope. Not yet. Just the muscle memory of being the kind of person who didn't give up. The kind of person who kept the real thing close, hidden, waiting. She released the fabric and let her hand fall. The cemetery was empty. Just the rain and the moss hanging from the oaks like ghost hair and the weight of 7 years of silence. Laura stood there for 34 minutes, breathing through her nose, letting the rain drench her completely. She was suspended pending review. Sterling had activated his network. The hospital board chairman was ready to move. Her fabricated past would collapse under investigation. There was nowhere to go from here except backward, into invisibility, into the box she'd been living in since Tom died. She turned from the grave and walked back to her car, a 2016 Honda Civic parked at the cemetery entrance, the only vehicle left in the lot. She was reaching for the door handle when she heard it. Distant at first. Then closer. A sound she'd heard 1,000 times before, in another life, in a place where sound meant salvation. The thud-thud-thud of helicopter rotors, approaching from the northeast, cutting through the rain like a blade through silk. Laura froze. Her hand was still on the car door. The rotor sound grew louder, more distinct, and she could identify it now, the deeper, heavier rhythm of a military aircraft. Multiple aircraft. The rain suddenly felt electric, charged with something that wasn't weather anymore. The sound came closer, and Laura's breath changed. Her shoulders changed. The woman standing in the rain with her hand on a car door began to reconstitute herself into something else, something the civilian world had never seen and would barely recognize. And then her phone began to buzz. Back at Mercy General, in the ICU bay where the general lay still recovering, something had changed. His eyes had opened. Not cloudy anymore. Not sedated anymore. The machines monitoring his vital signs showed a man returning to consciousness, to awareness, to the space between forgetting and remembering. His hand moved. It reached toward the call button, then stopped, trembling. His mouth opened. No sound came out, it never did anymore, but his eyes searched the room with sudden intensity. His gaze moved across the monitors, the 4 stands, the pale institutional walls, searching for something or someone. A nurse came in to check his vitals. He grabbed her wrist with surprising strength. His eyes went wide. His mouth moved again, silent, desperate, forming a single word over and over, Bennett. 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 Where is she? Where is the nurse who saved me? The question moved through Mercy General like an electrical current. It reached the administrative offices. It reached the board chairman's phone. It reached people in Washington who had been waiting for someone to ask that question. It had taken 24 hours. It had taken a man waking up and understanding, through the fog of trauma and medication, that he had been pulled back from the edge of darkness by someone whose hands had the precision of muscle memory and the strength of someone who had done this before, had saved him before, in a place he could barely remember anymore. It had taken him asking where she was. And the answer to that question was about to change everything. The next morning arrived grey and cold. Laura's locker was half empty, her name tag already removed from the employee roster when she punched in one last time to collect her things. Her hands moved on muscle memory, 3 years of belonging to Mercy General erased in 4 hours. She was folding her backup scrubs when the ER doors burst open with the sound of running feet on tile. Mom. Marcus's voice cracked across the lobby. Mom, they need to see these. Her 17-year-old son stood beneath the fluorescent lights holding a small wooden box, the kind that held something precious. His face was flushed, not with embarrassment, but with the kind of determination she recognized. The same look she'd seen in the mirror before every mission. Laura moved toward him, and the lobby stilled. Nurses paused at their stations. Orderlies stopped mid-stride. Something in the boy's posture commanded attention, some inherited weight that the hospital had no name for. My mother is Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett, Marcus said, his voice growing steadier. And I think you should know what she actually is. He opened the box. The room went silent. Not the quiet of a pause. The silence of certainty, the kind that arrives when someone speaks a truth that reshapes everything standing around it. A charge nurse stepped forward, her hands trembling as she reached for the file. Laura didn't move. Didn't reach for her son. didn't flinch at what was about to be read aloud to a room full of people she'd worked beside for 36 months while buried beneath a borrowed name. Navy Achievement Medal, the charge nurse whispered, reading from the official discharge papers. Bronze Star with Valor. She paused, swallowed. 2 Purple Hearts. The silence deepened. A man in a faded SEAL Team 3 shirt stepped from the crowd, grizzled, scarred across his left temple, the kind of weather that came from mountains and deserts and carrying things no one should have to carry. His eyes locked on Laura's with a recognition of kinship. She carried 8 wounded through 4 clicks of enemy fire in Sangin, he said, his voice like an engine that had run 1,000 hours without stopping. That woman earned every decoration in that box. Goddamn legend. We all owe her lives. Sterling wasn't in the lobby. Laura's chest knew that already, but her mind confirmed it as she scanned the crowd. He was somewhere behind a closed door, making calls, burning every network he'd spent years constructing. Too late. Always too late. The ER doors opened again. 2 men in dark suits, their badges reflecting the overhead lights. The taller one approached Dr. Sterling as he emerged from the administrative hallway, his face the color of old surgical gauze. Dr. Marcus Sterling, the agent said. Not a question. Yes, and I can explain. Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett's classified mission in Sangin has been declassified as of 0600 this morning. The agent's voice moved like a judge's gavel. Her termination at Mercy General constitutes federal retaliation against a protected operative. She is no longer suspended. You are. The hospital CEO appeared from her office, already moving toward Sterling with the efficiency of someone who understood optics. News cameras had followed the FBI agents inside. Their red lights blinked like predator eyes. You're fired, the CEO said, not quietly. Clear your office. You have 1 hour. Sterling's mouth opened. Closed. His hands, steady surgeon's hands that had held lives, began to shake. A nurse he'd humiliated last week turned her back to him. Then another. Then the entire staff shifted their weight away from him, a synchronized withdrawal that felt like a court-martial. The general appeared in the atrium doorway. His frame moved under its own power now, the mechanical uncertainty of someone relearning how muscles worked. But his eyes had clarity. Purpose. Recognition. He walked directly to Laura. The room parted for him like water before a keel. His mouth opened, shaped vowels that produced no sound, the damage too deep, the shrapnel having carved away the infrastructure of speech. But his hands told the story his voice could not. He pulled the faded unit patch from inside his jacket lining. It was identical to the one Laura had worn in Sangin 12 years ago, sewn with the same meticulous stitching, bearing the same 3rd Battalion insignia, the same ghosted bloodstain on its lower corner. His fingers trembled as he held it out. Then he dropped to one knee. The general, decorated, lethal, a man who had commanded armies, pressed the patch into her hands with both palms flat against the fabric, the gesture of a warrior acknowledging the one who'd pulled him from the wreckage. His shoulders heaved without sound. Grief expressed in silence, the way soldiers learn to mourn. Laura looked down at the patch. At her son standing 17 years into a life she'd built for him in obscurity. At the SEAL veteran whose eyes held 12 years of knowing who she was. At a hospital that would never look the same. She held the patch against her chest. Your discharge was falsified, the FBI agent announced to the gathered staff. Laura Bennett was never removed from active registry. She was never allowed to leave. The Navy wanted her erased because what happened in Sangin complicated certain operational narratives. The agent's stare landed on Sterling like a hammer. The federal government takes exception to that. 2 more agents appeared. Sterling tried to move toward the administrative hallway. One agent shifted position, a subtle angling of the body that wasn't threat but was unmistakably command. Sterling stopped moving. I was trying to protect the hospital, Sterling said, his voice collapsing toward desperation. She performed unauthorized procedures. She saved the general's life, the charge nurse said from across the lobby. I watched the monitors. She saved his life. Sterling's jaw clenched. His eyes found Laura's, and in that moment, something broke behind his pupils. Not shame. Not regret. The specific panic of a man who'd built his entire architecture on hierarchy, on the understanding that protocols and boards and phone calls would protect him. It was collapsing now, audibly, in front of cameras and federal agents and every person he'd ever intimidated. You don't understand what you're doing, he said to the agents, to the cameras, to anyone who would listen. His voice was climbing now, the controlled tone fragmenting. She's dangerous. This woman is unstable. Enough, the taller agent said. Sterling didn't stop. He moved toward Laura with his hand raised, some gesture that might have been explanation or accusation or something uglier. The agent moved with mechanical precision, stepping between them, his hand near his belt in the way that meant consequences. Do not approach her, he said. Sterling's face flushed now, not the composed fading to white he'd shown in the administrative offices. Actual color flooded his cheeks. Sweat beaded across his hairline. He looked toward the assembled staff, toward the cameras, toward the hospital that had given him authority, and found only silence and turned backs. This isn't over, he said, but his voice had become small. A child's voice in a man's throat. Yes, it is, the CEO said quietly. They handcuffed him by the elevators. Laura watched from the center of the lobby, watched his wrists click into restraints, watched him being walked toward the door she'd entered this morning to clean out her locker, watched him pass the grizzled SEAL veteran whose expression didn't change, whose eyes simply tracked Sterling's movement with the patience of a predator that had waited for justice longer than Sterling had been alive. The news cameras followed. His walk to the FBI vehicle was recorded. His refusal to speak was recorded. The moment a young nurse, one of the 7 he'd pressured to refuse treatment, allowed a tear to escape without wiping it away as he was driven from the parking lot. All of it recorded. The general's hand touched Laura's shoulder. She turned and found him standing there, mute and whole and conscious of her for the first time since sedation had taken that knowledge from him. His lips moved. Nothing emerged but breath. She understood anyway. 2 hours later, the hospital announced a complete review of its trauma protocols. 6 months later, a new veteran trauma wing opened on the 3rd floor, renamed the Bennett Unit for Trauma and Care. The general's first post-surgical words, whispered through a reconstructed larynx in the recovery suite, were Laura's name. Sterling sold cut-rate life insurance from a folding table outside a strip mall clinic in Tucson. His name tag read, Steve. Every time someone called him doctor, his shoulders pulled inward like he'd taken a body shot. 6 months of that. 9 months. The folding table grew shabbier. The script in his hands developed tremors that had nothing to do with age. Laura stood at the entrance to Mercy General's new trauma unit, the title Chief of Emergency Operations on her badge, the authority she'd earned long before bureaucracy tried to erase it. She wore scrubs. Not the administrator's white coat they'd offered her. Not the lab coat that came with the office. Scrubs, the uniform of hands that moved towards suffering instead of away from it. A patient called from Trauma Bay 1. A GSW to the abdomen. Blood loss significant. The surgical team was assembling. Laura moved toward the sound. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, all the years of being less than what she was, compressed into the moment before she was allowed to be more. Every insult Sterling had delivered. Every doctor's refusal. Every night standing at her husband's grave whispering about failure. It had all been building toward this, a room full of people who would follow her orders because they'd seen what she could do when the rules stopped protecting those who broke them. She stepped into the bay. The surgical team turned toward her. In their eyes, respect that had been earned in blood and earned in silence and earned across 12 years of sacrifice that no paperwork could erase. Let's move, she said, and everything that she was moved with her. The hospital learned that heroes don't announce themselves. They work night shifts and accept humiliation and smile at dismissal and save lives in rooms where no one is watching. And when the moment comes when someone finally sees who they actually are, that moment doesn't change them. It just confirms what they've always known about themselves. If you've ever been told you were too much for an institution, too dangerous for a system, too honest for a hierarchy that needed your silence more than your skills, recognize those people in your life. The ones who've been buried beneath titles that don't fit. The ones whose sacrifice you'll never fully understand because they made it look so easy that you mistook it for weakness. Don't wait for their son to show up with a box of medals. Don't wait for federal agents to declassify the truth. Speak up now. Ensure no warrior's sacrifice goes unacknowledged while they're still standing in front of you wearing scrubs instead of ribbons. Subscribe. Like. Comment with the name of someone in your life who deserves to be seen.